بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا مولانا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ثم أما بعد. So we resume inshallah where we left off, and we're reading the hadith of Sayyidina Anas ibn Malik. May Allah be pleased with him, that he narrates where he says that we used to pray with the Prophet ﷺ, and one of us would put a part of his garment or clothing he was wearing in this place of sujood because of the heat, shiddat al-har, from the ground. And we spoke a little bit about some of the characteristics of the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ during his time, and how it was uncovered. It didn't have carpet or marble or tile or anything of this sort. It was just rocks or pebbles and sand, and they could get quite hot during the day. And we see that the Prophet ﷺ would take this into consideration even with the prayer times themselves. Some of the hadith narrate, and I believe it's in Al-Bukhari, how he would delay dhuhr prayer a little bit if it was going to be prayed in jama'ah, ila al-hajira, or later on because of the heat of dhuhr. So he would delay it somewhat so as not to be like exactly at high noon or at the beginning of the prayer time when it was the hottest during the day. He would also, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you could say, would make an interesting study of looking how climatic conditions affect the sunnah or the ibadah, because it can be taken into consideration. He would on occasion combine Maghrib and Isha due to two factors, darkness of night, and the madhahib have some tafsil about what are the conditions, but at least the Maliki method I'm familiar with, they say it has to be a dark night, cannot be a night where there's a full moon out, and also in wahid, which would mean rain, and then rain mixing with the mud and the road. So in other words, making it difficult to go back and forth to the masjid. So the condition was prayed in jama'ah in a masjid, it's a dark night, and there's some condition like rain or mud that prevents one from going back and forth. So they would combine both Maghrib and Isha at the time of Maghrib, the earlier time, so as to have the jama'ah, and then people go home and they don't have to come back and a short time later to pray the Isha prayer. So again, these are all examples of yusr, of ease, that we see in the flexibility of the Sharia and Muhammadiyah, yani of how we're able to take in consideration people's own physical condition, their conditions outside, and so forth. So the ayah rings true even more so when we contemplate it in light of what we mentioned here. وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ, and He has not made anything of the deen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from haraj, from undue hardship. And this hadith can also be understood in that light, that when there are certain factors that are considered, something that normally is frowned upon or even makruh, this like which is here is haraka in the prayer. In other words, to have extraneous action that is not from the prayer. And amongst that extraneous action be to put like your sleeve or something here so that you prostrate on it instead of the hot sandals that normally they would prostrate on. So normally that's not allowed, or normally it could even invalidate the prayer if it's too much haraka, too much extraneous action. But in this case, because as I mentioned in the previous hadith, the islah as-salah, it's for something that's rectifying the prayer. So the fuqaha, they differentiated between actions that rectify the prayer and actions that do not rectify the prayer. So if it's something that rectifies the prayer, then there is some flexibility. But to a certain point, it cannot be to the extent that it's no longer deemed to be, someone looking at you would have a question about whether you're actually praying or you do something else. So, you can't say, I got very hungry while I was praying, and so I was thinking about my hunger, so I wanted to concentrate on my prayer, so I ate my sandwich while I was in ruku' or sujood, or while the tahiyya in the middle, sitting, I ate a sandwich and then I continued. No, the deen doesn't work like that. That would be too much extraneous action. But something like this, they even mentioned moving to a place in the line, in the saf, or moving back or moving forwards, also is allowed because it's for islah as-salah, salat al-jama'ah, so forth. Again, in a way that's not to seem extraneous. Some of the other madhab, the Shafi'i madhab in particular, is a little more strict. They say more than 2 consecutive extraneous actions would invalidate the prayer. Whereas the Maliki madhab says it has to be not by number of actions, but by what's known by urf, by custom. Yani if it looks like they're not praying, then it means they're not praying. But as I said, they all agree that if it's for islah as-salah, something to rectify the prayer in this, as in this regards, then it's something that's perfectly fine and it's allowed. So I think we'll move on to the next hadith, inshallah. Also on Anas ibn Malik, radiallahu anhu, النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم رأى نخامة في القبلة فحكها بيده ورؤي منه كراهية أو رؤي كراهيته لذلك وشدته عليه وقال إن أحدكم إذا قام في صلاته فإنما يناجي ربه أو ربه بينه وبين قبلته فلا يبزقن في قبلته ولكن عن يساره أو تحت قدمه ثم أخذ طرف ردائه فبزق فيه ورد بعضه على بعض وقال أو يفعل هكذا. So also narrated on the authority of Anas ibn Malik, may Allah be pleased with him, radiallahu anhu, that the Prophet ﷺ saw what is mentioned here, nukhama, in the area of the qibla. Nukhama, they said, is spittle that comes from either the chest or inside the mouth. So someone had spat towards the direction of the qibla. فَحَكَّهَا بِيَدِهِ, so he wiped it with his hand. وَرُؤِيَ مِنْهُ كَرَاهِيَةٌ, so here the Rawi says, Anas, that it was seen from him his dislike or displeasure at this. أو رؤيا كراهيته لذلك وشدته عليه, or it was seen, slightly different phrasing, seen that he disliked this and he was not happy, or shidda, yani, in other words, he was seen in his face his displeasure at this event. And then he said, if one of you is standing in prayer, then let him know, yunaji rabbahu, and this word I brought up before, munajah, is having like a secret or inner conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Aw, here aw means or, he said, aw rabbuhu baynahu wa bayna qiblati, or he should know that his Lord is between him and his qibla. فَلَا يَبْزُقَنَّ فِي قِبْلَتِهِ, so he should not spit in the direction of the qibla. وَلَكِنْ عَنْ يَسَارِهِ أَوْ تَحْتَ قَدَمِهِ, but rather on his left or underneath his foot. ثُمَّ أَخَذَ طَرَفَ رِدَائِهِ, then he took the taraf of his rida, his outer garment covering, and then he wiped it, in other words, to show how to wipe or to bury the spittle when it happens. Yani from the general wording of the hadith, it seems like, okay, so the Prophet ﷺ, someone had spat and he just cleaned it up, and that was the end of it. But actually there are many, many things we can get out of this particular hadith. First, we see that the Prophet ﷺ, the first line, رَأَى نُخَامَةً فِي الْقِبْلَةِ, right? And usually if we see spittle somewhere, it's not something that really stands out at you. It's not like you can just see it incidentally as you're walking around. You have to actually be looking for it. It's small. The assumption here is not the guy didn't, have a bucket of it. Just, he spat and it was left towards the area of the qibla. So that means that the Prophet ﷺ, كان يتفقد ahwal al-masjid. He used to look and see the state of the masjid. In other words, it's his masjid, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, masjid al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as such, it's entrusted to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That being the case, he was a nadir, part of his nubuwah in his, let's say, his duties towards the masjid. He was a nadir, and a nadir is someone who takes care of affairs of something they're entrusted with. So if someone is entrusted with taking care of affairs of something, that means they check on it. That means they regularly have an idea about what's going on, right? When we hear about all of these financial scandals that are happening recently, either in the corporate world or even outside of the corporate world, and people, then the guy up top says, well, I had no idea. It was all the people underneath, I wasn't part of any of that. Yeah, but you should have an idea, right? If that's your mas'uliyah, if that's your responsibility, then part of your responsibility is you should know. You should make it your business to know. Someone who just covers their eyes and is blind to everything that's going on, then either they're blind on purpose or they're incompetent. If you're incompetent, step aside and let someone who is competent look it over. And if you're not incompetent and you're purposefully ignoring it, then you're not the person for the job. You're not the person for that responsibility. Let someone else who can handle the responsibility handle it. So the Prophet ﷺ, he was showing us and the Sahaba and those after him, this is how to take care of your responsibility. That even something as minuscule and maybe perhaps insignificant as spittle, he took the care to remove it and to treat it and so forth, as we see in the rest of the hadith of his sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we begin to ask ourselves, how many of us do that with the masjid, or what we're entrusted to? We're all caretakers of the masjid. We're all entrusted with it. Do we see it as our responsibility, or we say, yeah, the cleaning crew will take care of it? If we're walking up the steps and some trash is there, do we pick it up and throw it away? Or do we say, yeah, that someone has that job, that's not me, and it's not mine? Because that shows that the community has to have ownership of like a masjid, of like a school, things that are there for the community good, the public good. Just as in our own homes, if we see something of trash, we wouldn't think twice. No, we don't want that in our house. Why you feel this way about your house? Because it's yours, right? Why you feel this way about your automobile, your car? Because you feel it's yours, and so you have a responsibility, or you feel like, either you feel like you have a responsibility, or you feel like, well, I don't want anyone to see that I'm not taking care of my stuff, that type of thing. In either case, it still is the impetus for you to act and to maintain it. And then if you're not, then there's probably something intrinsically wrong with you. Something is going on that's not right. But most people, they do that. But when we look to, let's say, community institutes or community affairs, and I include in that schools, I include in that mosques, masajid, anything that's there for a community purpose, it's not really the ownership of one single person, it's the ownership of the community. Everyone should feel that ownership, and everyone should put that effort through to maintain it, and not say someone else will do it. Because the thing about our Sharia is the idea that there are communal obligations, and this is called fard kifaya, right? It's a communal obligation, which means if the whole community or one person in the community fails to do it, then everyone is held responsible. Everyone is responsible. Versus the fard ayn, right? And the fard ayn means it's an individual obligation. Praying the 5 prayers is fard ayn for everybody, except the ones who certain conditions don't pray at certain times. But outside of that, generally speaking, fard ayn for everybody. Fard kifaya is a communal obligation. A certain segment or group of people, or 1 or 2, have to do it. Salat al-janaza, مثلا, is an example of fard kifaya. Someone dies, someone has to wash the body, someone has to pray on the body. Suppose we left the body and we did nothing, it's lying in the street. The whole community is held responsible, because some of us should have taken that responsibility. And that means if some of us should take that responsibility, that means we need to have like a system for ensuring that responsibility is taken up. So we can decide amongst ourselves and say, okay, you and you, when someone dies, you'll wash the body and you'll tell people about to come to the masjid, and you'll call the imam to come pray, whatever. So there's to have a system about going or doing it is fine. Just as you have board of trustees, right? What's a board of trustees? That's a board that means this responsibility, this affair is your responsibility. Not that it's a privilege, right? People think when they're put in charge of something, they're privileged now. They're a leader. That means they should have certain perks. That means they should have an assigned spot in the parking lot because they're a board of trustee. Yeah, I'm a board of trustee. I'm the chairman. I am the chairman. Yeah, you got to give me my own spot. And I get my own spot at the lunch table, and I have my own place in the first row. Don't take that from me. I'm the chairman. You're a servant. You're a khadim. Right? You're to serve the community, serve the masjid. That's how you look at it. If you don't think you're a servant and you think you're entitled and you're privileged, you're not the right person to do it. That was the Prophet ﷺ. He could have told some of the other Sahaba to change it, to fix it, couldn't you? They saw him do it. Anas ibn Malik saw it. He didn't say, Fulan. He didn't say, Anas, ta'al, wipe this up for me. Because he's the chairman, right? He's the top. He didn't say that. He did it himself. So even if you are in a hierarchy, and you're the top one in the hierarchy, follow the example of the Prophet ﷺ. He didn't feel the need to have one of the lesser people, so to speak. He didn't even think that way. Get one of the young men. Anas was young. Come. No. He did it himself for several reasons. One, to provide the example, to show people. And one, to show that في فعل الخير, right, in doing acts of good and doing acts of charity, there is no hierarchy. There is nothing that's beneath you. No such thing. Because if you think it's beneath you, right, then that's not an act of good or charity. That's something else. You're doing it for dunya, you're doing it for accolades, you're doing it to capture the attention of people, whatever reason. But it's fa'al al-khayr, if it's an act of good, helping someone infirm across the street, whatever the khayr is, right, like mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, الإيمان بدعة وستون شعبة أو في رواية بدعة وسبعون شعبة أعلاها لا إله إلا الله وأسفلها إماتة الأذى عن الطريق. Iman is some 62 or 72 parts, and Imam al-Bayhaqi has a book where he lists them, and it's translated, I think by Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad, if I'm not mistaken. And he said its highest form of Iman is saying La ilaha illallah. That's in terms of Iman. And its lowest, or the last part of Iman, is removing adha min at-tariq, removing something harmful from harm's way, in a general pathway. People are walking and they could trip on that, or they could some type of makruh, something undesirable happen to them. Then that's part of Iman, is to feel the responsibility to take care of it, and not only that, but to do something about it, if you can do something about it. Because the idea about doing good means not just recognizing it, but it means actually doing it when you can. If you have the ability to do it, and it's within all of the necessary conditions, and it's something amr bil ma'ruf, nahy anil munkar, wa mujma' alayhi, there's a consensus, not a difference of opinion issue, and you could do something to change it, you have to change it. That's what you're here for. Why else would you not do it? There's no such thing as it's beneath me, laziness, or it's someone else, or I'll call someone, to come do it. If you can do it, you will be ma'jur, you will be rewarded for that. And if the Prophet ﷺ, by his noble hand, ﷺ, هذه اليد الشريفة, do you know what it is? This is the hand that's going to feed us from the pool, from the hawd. That will make the difference for you between heaven and hell. That's what that is. That same hand, he used his hand to wipe away that spit. So if that noble hand didn't feel that it was beneath it, or it was lessing or unbecoming to do so, then who are we to say that this is unbecoming, or this is beneath me, or this is not reflective of my state, or my maqam, or my hal, or kalam al-fadi that people say, this empty talk that people read some words here and there and then they start to believe it about themselves. Nas'Allah al-afiyah. So he حكها بيده, right, and he removed it. But before that it said نخامة في القبلة, fil qibla, what does that mean in the qibla? Remember how we talked about what the Prophet's mosque looked like? It didn't have a mihrab, like a prayer niche. It was more like this, like a wall. So there was one wall that was actually the direction of the qibla. So it didn't mean it was like right where the imam stands. It could have been anywhere along this wall. And he saw that, the spittle. So that means even the direction of the qibla, its very direction, there is something sacred about it. There is something sacrosanct about even direction of qibla. And that's why many of the ulama said that one should try to face the qibla even in their endeavors, even outside of prayer. Like if you're reading something, memorizing something, facing qibla is enjoined. And if you're doing something that's not sacred, that's quite the opposite. They said, for example, like one relieving oneself should be avoided to either face or have your back to the qibla. And that's assuming you're not inside an enclosed area. So you don't have to go rearranging your bathrooms in your houses if, it's not exact. They're talking about out fil falat, out in, people didn't used to have bathrooms. So when you have a choice of which direction to face, then you avoid facing or putting your back towards the qibla. So you're sideways, perpendicular to the qibla. وهذا adab, and that's the ihram of holding the qibla to be somewhat sacred. So in our deen, we have things that are muqaddas or held sacred based upon their symbolic nature, right? Because the direction of something, that's symbolic. Symbolic of what? Symbolic of the divine presence. That's what it's symbolic of. Why do we pray in that direction? Well, that's where the Kaaba is. Okay. What's the Kaaba? It's also a symbol, right? The Kaaba is also a symbol. And its sacredness lies in the sacredness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has attached to the Kaaba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a physical presence that we can pray towards, right? Because He doesn't have a place, He doesn't have a time. And we'll get into that a little bit more when I reach the part about Him being in between the qibla. But that being said, that means that there are symbols because of our own human nature that we have a hard time fathoming that. How can He have not a place in time? And then how do we know Him? How do we worship Him? And He's only known not by His essence, because we can't comprehend His essence. It's beyond our nature. He is known by His signs. In other words, symbols. What's a sign or a symbol? Something that indicates something else. Something that's an evidence or a dalil to something else. So how do we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We know Him by His athar. His athar are like the famous saying that they say of the Bedouin, that al-ba'ratu tadullu ala al-ba'ir, right? That the camel droppings indicate there was a camel there. So he didn't see the camel, but he knew there was a camel there. فكيف أرض ذات أمواج وذات جبال لا تدل على الواحد الأحد. So how is it that a world full of incredible things like mountains and oceans and waves and all of the things, and even the human form itself, does not indicate and does not point to al-wahid, it does not point to the one, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as the poet said, ألا في كل شيء آية تدل على أنه هو الواحد. In everything there is a sign that points to He is the one. And that's Tawheed. Tawheed is realizing all of this multiplicity that we see around us is the Zahir. Remember how we talked about Zahir and Batin. Zahir means external things. So externally, wow, it looks like all different types of colors and shapes and forms and people and understandings and intelligences and heights and weights, and it's all so various, also multiple. But if that's all you see nothing. What you see is what's behind that, namely only the one could have made all of that. There's no other conclusion you can arrive to. The sane, the aqil person, the one who thinks about this deeply, can reach no other conclusion. And in fact, read history, you'll find all of them reach that same conclusion. What we're living in now is some type of sort of exceptional period where people can deny the existence of God, and it's seen as something that's virtuous. Even the who they hold up as their great scientists and role models and things like that, they were all monotheists, and they were all what we would call natural philosophers. In other words, they studied science in order to understand the one. That was the philosophy behind science before. Now people study science so they know how to manipulate the world and make it to their own use. That's why people study science now. Read Newton, read Galileo. Even Galileo was vilified by the church. He believed in one God. He wasn't an atheist. Newton wasn't an atheist. Newton studied so that to know how the workings of God. That's what they talked about. That's what they were looking for. But post-Enlightenment, and it's a long history, but what happened is now this has been divorced from its original course, its original understanding, and now science has been completely seen as almost antithetical to religion, like there should be at odds. And there's no reason to be at odds. Because if science is about understanding the workings of the world, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the world, then where's the contradiction? Why does it have to be a conflict? It's a complementary thing. And in fact, we're encouraged to contemplate and reflect upon the signs of the creation. Allah says, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَةٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Right? الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم. In a later ayah, الذين يتفكرون في خلق السماوات ويقولون ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك وقنا عذاب النار. Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, there are signs, and the changing of day and night, there are signs for those who reflect, right? And then it says, those who think about the creation of the heavens and earth, and then they say, Allah subhanak, you did not create this out of nothing. There's a reason behind it. فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. So keep us from the chastisement of the hellfire. And then what else do they do after the fikr? They have thinking and they have contemplation. What is the natural state of affairs that should happen immediately after that? Dhikr. الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ. After fikr, they say, أَوَّلُ الذِّكْرِ الْفِكْرِ. The first stage of dhikr is fikr. It's thinking, it's contemplating. So after you contemplate everything around you, then you find you have no other choice but to make dhikr. Because all of it is pointing to the one. And you have to remember the one. And then how do they make dhikr? الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا, standing up, وَقُعُودًا, sitting down, وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ, laying down. So that means, either we're sitting down or we're standing up or laying down. That means all the time. Dhikr is an all the time affair. There's no particular time for it. Anytime, anywhere. وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ ذِكْرًا كَثِيرًا. Right? The only ayah that says it about a particular ibadah in this manner, using the word kathira, dhikr. وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ ذِكْرًا كَثِيرًا وَسَبِّحُوهُ بُكْرَةً وَأَصِيلًا. وَسَبِّحُوهُ, tasbih is a type of dhikr. So this is like عطف الخاص على العام. Tasbih is saying subhanallah. It's tanzih. It's declaring that Allah is above and beyond everything that we see around here. هو منزه. He transcends everything. بُكْرَةً وَأَصِيلًا. Bukratan early in the morning, wa asila later in the afternoon before sunset. Not sure how we got here. The Qibla. So the Qibla is something that is sacred in and of its sense, the direction. And Allah, as we said, is free from direction and all that. But nonetheless, as we mentioned, the ulama talked about this. So that means also we should refrain from doing things in the direction of the Qibla, like I said. Some of the ulama said when you're sitting in a masjid, even to outstretch your feet towards the Qibla is bad form, is bad adab. That should be refrained from. So all of these things is indicated in a sense by the hadith. وَرُؤْيَ مِنْهُ كَرَاهِيَةٌ أو رُؤْيَ كَرَاهِيَةُ لِذَلِكَ. They're almost the same. It's just a simple, instead of min, it was seen from him, the first one, seen from him his dislike for this, or it was seen his dislike for this. That's it. But why did the Sahabi, Anas ibn Malik, include both? Because he was unsure. He heard one of the two. And you'll find this often in the hadith. Like, And this aw, which means or, indicates a shak or a slight doubt from the rawi, from the narrator. Sometimes it's a sahabi, sometimes it's the one above the sahabi, like a tabi'i, and sometimes the ulama like Al-Bukhari and others are not sure where the doubt came from. But the riwayah, the narrator came with that particular part. And this actually shows that a couple of things. One, that if they didn't say oh, if they didn't say or, and they just said the hadith as was, then that probably indicates that's exactly the way the Prophet ﷺ said it. Because even though narrating the hadith bil ma'na, narrating hadith by meaning only and not by the exact wording is permissible, as many of the later ulama said, but in terms of the Sahaba, most clearly it was definitely their madhab or their way is to narrate the hadith to the exact wording of the Prophet ﷺ, if he said something, in as much as they could. And sometimes you have slight variations between different ruwat, different narrators of the hadith for the same hadith, based upon a different wording they might have heard. Either it was a different wording they might have heard, or it was a different occasion, could have been said at a different time, or this one said it, he heard it this way, and another one heard it that way. But in general terms, it's by the meaning and not necessarily by the exact lafz or wording. But when they show their precision like this, it means they had a lot of attention to the wording. And that means that even lafz al-hadith, in a manner not dissimilar to the Quran, is sacred itself. So they wanted to preserve the wording of the Prophet ﷺ. And so whenever there was a possibility, he said one of the two, they put both. Because there's a barakah. There's a blessing in how the Prophet ﷺ, the exact way he said it. And so they preserve that in their ahadith. And it doesn't indicate, as some have said, that this shows that they were not sure about what they heard and they had bad memories. No, it's quite the opposite. It shows they had good memories and they were very precise in how they related the hadith and their caution in doing so. Now, as to the meaning, al-karahiyya means a dislike or a displeasure. So there was some dislike or displeasure that the Prophet ﷺ, they said it was seen from him. How was it seen from him? Yani they noticed it in his facial expression. Shaykh Walead Mosaad, he said there was one or two reasons why the Prophet ﷺ was displeased about what had happened here, about someone put the nukhama or the spittle in the direction of the qibla. One, the first, is that there was a certain hurma, a certain sacredness, muntahak, that was violated. And so anyone who has a deep sense of affiliation with the Sharia and with Islam will feel upset when something of that is violated. And so that upsets them. And many of us feel that. And sometimes, though, many of us sort of justify our actions by saying, no, I have ghayra, I feel very strong about Islam, and so when someone does something haram that really upsets me, and so I got to really show them, and I have to uphold the truth and the haqq, right? And then they'll actually go and humiliate that person. What did you do? You just humiliated them. You couldn't. No, this is haqq, akhi. The Sharia says this. The Sharia says the Prophet ﷺ said when you walk into the masjid, you pray 2 rak'ahs. He just sat down. So I had to really, make an example out of him because this is haqq and we don't have there's no compromise in this. Okay, mashi, that's haqq. Is it also haqq to humiliate that person? Is also haqq in something that's a sunnah, that you force someone else to do it? Then they had the choice to do it or not. It's up to them. It's not something that's obligatory that you, fine, that's haqq. But you sort of justify it to yourself and saying, no, my ghira was for Islam. But maybe your ghira or your jealousy or your envy about the deen was more about envy about yourself. Maybe that brother, he leads the prayer sometimes, and you want to lead the prayer. So the first opportunity that you found to sort of do amr bil ma'roof and nahi anil munkar at his expense, you take it. But you say to yourself, no, I'm doing it for Islam. It's not about me. I'm not involved. Well, if it was someone else, would you have reacted the same way? Or if the circumstances were different, would you have done the same thing? If someone else corrected him, would that have bothered you? You feel like you had to do it. And you be honest with yourself and see. And then you ask yourself finally, was it really for Islam? Or was it really something of my nafs? Was it a nafsi type of thing that made me do this? And then everyone is honest with themselves at that point. So that type of ghayra for Islam, most people claim, but how many of us really have it? Allahu A'lam. Then the second one he mentions is very interesting, Ibn Abi Jamrah. He said that the Prophet ﷺ, he said this is the more likely one actually than the first. The more likely one is that the Prophet ﷺ, his displeasure was that whoever did this, did so and they harmed themselves. So it's almost like a shafaqa or compassion for someone who harmed themselves by breaking this sacrosanctity of the qibla. So not angry at the person, not wanting to do something to them, but you're angry for them. You want them to do the right thing. Huh? وَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسِكَ عَلَى آثَارِ إِنْ لَمْ يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ أَسَفًا. Don't we read that Surah Al-Kahf every week? What does that mean? It's talking about the Prophet ﷺ. وَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ. Perhaps you blame yourself, right, for what they do and they are not believing. When Jibreel alayhi salam, after Ta'if, right, when we know what happened to the Prophet ﷺ when he went to Ta'if, and little kids threw rocks at him and made him leave until his back of his heels were bleeding. A very difficult day for him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then Jibreel came to him, alayhi salam, and said, if you like, I can take the two mountains of this area and make it fall upon them and destroy them. You know, if they upset you that much. He said, La. No. Because I hope, and I am hopeful from their progeny, from their children, will be those who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it was as he said. The Ta'if entered into Islam, and Bani Thaqif, who were the tribe there, all of them became Muslim. So he wasn't a prophet of revenge, of intiqam. And they were kuffar. They rejected him. Right? He didn't say, make dua against them. He even had the opportunity to do something for Allah to take revenge upon them. He didn't. So he was upset more for them, not because of his nafs or himself. How many of us, we claim that we're upset for the deen or upset for Islam, and we talk about these kuffar this and these fusat that, and look what they're doing. Where's your anger coming from? Is it a nafsani anger? Right? Because you can feel the difference. When it's something coming from your nafs, it doesn't have bounds, doesn't have parameters. It can go really far, and you can do almost despicable things, and you justify it to yourself based upon that anger. But when it's based upon a true ghadab lillah, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it has its parameters. Ibn Abi Jamrah, he narrates a story of one of the Salihin. He said that one of the local sultans or the muluk, he had a ship come in that had bottles of wine and so forth coming to the palace. And so this person who had a ghayra for the deen, he said, I can't allow this. So when the ship came into port, he went on deck and he took a stick or something and broke every single bottle of wine on that ship, knowing what the sultan can do to him, except one. He came to the last one and he left it. Then he left the ship. And so the sultan, he asked, what happened to my wine? He said, well, this guy, he came in and just destroyed the whole thing. But he left one. So the sultan, why did he leave one? So he said, bring him to me. So they asked him, and he said, مَا حَمَلَكَ عَلَى هَذَا? Why did you do that? He said, this is what I felt, and I did what I felt was right, so let the sultan do what he feels is right, if he thinks he wants to do anything to me. And then he was asked, well, why did you leave the last one like that? He said, when I started doing it, when I got to the last one, I started thinking to myself, instead of I'm doing this for Allah, I said to myself, look, I am someone who does amr bil ma'roof and nahi anil munkar. You know, I am a person of haqq, I'm a person of this. So my nafs started to get into it. So I didn't want to break the last one, so I left it. Because at that point it became nafsi for me. And I left it. And then the Sultan said, leave him. There's nothing between me and this man. For his sidq, for his honesty. So how many of us can claim that we can not have our nafs in it? It's a very difficult criteria. It's not easy. Because the nafs overwhelms you. But perhaps Allah will gaze upon us with a nadar of rahmah, a nadar of lutf and gentleness and mercy, and He will avail us of the potential that we all have inside of us. So, the Prophet ﷺ, as Ibn Abu Jamrah said, was more likely upset that here was someone who wronged themselves. Because that's how the Quran looks at when someone commits a sin. It's actually dhulm al-nafs. You're wronging yourself. You might have wronged someone else, but ultimately you've wronged yourself because it's going to come back to you. It's going to come back and you'll be held accountable for it. While those people that you wronged, Allah is not going to hold them into account for what you did to them. In fact, it could be a source of blessing and bounty in the next life for them. But for you, it's quite the opposite. And then the Prophet ﷺ, after he did this, he wiped it. He said, إِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ إِذَا قَامَ فِي صَلَاتِ فَإِنَّمَا يُنَاجِي رَبَّهُ. أو, here the أو again the same thing. He wanted to make sure that whichever one he heard, that both of them were recorded. أو ربه بينه وبين قبلته. So the first one, إنما يناجي ربه فإنما يناجي ربه, is having a conversation or like a dialogue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in munajah is something that's two-way. So as I said before, when you read the Quran, which is part of the prayer, then that's a type of Allah speaking to you, because you're speaking His words. And then when you make tasbih and dhikr and dua, you are speaking to Him. So that's a munajah. That means it's a conversation that there's no third in it. It's only you and Him. So if this is the case, and this is in the direction of your qibla in your prayer, then one should not spit while they're praying or in the direction of praying. And our ulama said that there are three things where we should find this type of munajah or uns with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we're praying, when we're reading Quran, and we're making dhikr. Those three. If you don't find it in that, if you don't feel like a sense of uns, a sense of calm and drawing closer to Allah in either of these three activities, question yourself. And really question yourself. Because those are the routes, that's how we get to it. If none of them are having an effect on you, then that means that your heart, perhaps unfortunately, has become no longer a viable receptacle for ma'ani, for meanings that Allah can send your way. And Allah sends these meanings every day and every second that go around and move around. And if they find a receptacle, namely your heart, that they can find a home in, they'll reside there. But if it's not receptive to it, it bounces and goes away to someone else. So in order for your heart to be that receptacle, you have to have a pure heart. You have to remove denas, you have to remove the filth from it. The filth of shahawat, the filth of looking at things we're not supposed to look at, and listening to things we're not supposed to listen to, and thinking about things that it's better avoided to be thinking about. Otherwise, it won't find that place where it can reside in. So, the second part, أَوْ رَبُّهُ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ قِبْلَتِهِ, that his Lord is between him and his qibla. So, what does that mean? That Allah is like actually there, in between me and the qibla physically? Impossible. Mustaheel. So even in this hadith, it's a clear evidence for some of those who said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a physical place. He has no physical place, because He transcends place and time. Right? In one of the akhbar, Ibn Ata uses it in Al-Hikam. He says, كان الله ولا شيء معه وهو الآن على ما عليه كان. كان Allah was there, ولا شيء معه, and nothing was with Him. Here nothing, la shay, means time and place too. Because time and place is part of dunya. So if there was nothing before the dunya and nothing before us, then there was no time and there was no place. وَهُوَ الْآنِ عَلَى مَا عَلَيْهِ كَانَ. And he is now as he was then, before he created everything. So Allah is transcendent of time, transcendent of place. So that means we have to understand this ibara, this particular phrase, not in a literal sense, in a metaphorical sense. And that's the basic qaida, principle, that's both in Arabic language and later adopted as within itself, as it is in the Arabic language, by the ulama of the deen, the ulama of the tafsir, ulama al-usul, ulama al-hadith. It's a basic principle that runs through, which says that you understand the zahir of the kalam, or the outward meaning, or the ostensible meaning of any text, whether it be the hadith or the Quran, in as much as it can be understood that way. However, if there is a qarina, and qarina they mean by some outward or external text, or it could be intrinsic to the text itself, that indicates you are not to understand it in its literal sense, then you understand it in a more metaphorical and figurative sense. So when we say we know intellectually and rationally, and by even external sources, other sources from the Quran and the Sunnah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transcends time and place, and He can't be physically in a physical place, then we can say safely that this part, رَبُّهُ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ قِبْلَتِهِ, because بَيْنَ is what's called a dharf makan in Arabic language, which means it's a physical preposition, so to speak. So it indicates place. But since we know that that's impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we know it's impossible that it could mean physical here. And we know that metaphorical meanings are also part of the language, just like in any language. And there are many ayahs in the Quran when, for example, Surah Al-Baqarah, it says, يَجْعَلُونَ أَصَابِعَهُمْ فِي آذَانِهِمْ مِنَ الصَّوَاقِ حَذَرَ الْمَوْتِ. They put their fingers in their ears not to hear the da'wah, right? Does it mean their whole finger? So like all the way through like that? No. Why? Because that's not possible. So it means just the tips, just the part of the finger. So that means there's a slight metaphorical meaning that has to be inferred when you read that ayah, because otherwise it's impossible. And much in the same vein, it's impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be in a physical place. So it can't be understood in that way. And so بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ قِبْلَتِهِ, yani in your munajah, in your dialogue only with you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, know that this particular space in between you and the qibla is sacred. There's a hurma. And we'll see later hadith of, someone, that's why you have a sutra, and someone shouldn't cross in front of you and your qibla, right? Because that's a sacred space between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's as if like I'm having a conversation with Brother Ursulan, and one of you just like walks in between us and just stands there. Ayy. We would say, he has bad form, or what's wrong with him. So imagine when this is happening and it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you're speaking to. So there's sort of that type of sacredness to it. And we've run out of time for this session. So I'll come back and finish this and then the next one, inshallah. Jazakumullah.